So welcome to this introductory training on child-friendly spaces in humanitarian settings. My name is Mel Powell and I'm a technical advisor at the IFRC Reference Centre for Psychosocial Support.
And my name is Susanna Akasha. I'm also a technical advisor at the IFRC Reference Centre for Psychosocial Support.
And we're running this training to live up to our humanitarian obligation in crisis, conflict and emergencies.
And during this training you will use different materials. You will use the operational guidance for child-friendly spaces in humanitarian settings, the activity catalogue that goes with it, and finally, you will also use the activity cards that are part of the kit, and you will use the IFRC Secretariat policy on child safeguarding.
So the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which has been signed by all countries around the world except the United States of America, state that children have the right to be protected from being mistreated physically and mentally. The article then goes on to say that every child has the right to rest and leisure and to engage in play and recreational activities appropriate to the age of the child and to participate freely in cultural life and the arts.
So actually, a child-friendly space is a way that we can live up to the Convention of the Right of the Child. That is, if the conditions are right and methods used are safe for children. So a child-friendly space should not stop the children from going to school if schools are available and accessible. So overall, you'd say that the aim of the child-friendly space is to create protection from risk for children, to promote their psychosocial well-being, and also to strengthen child protection capacities of caregivers and communities. And by the way, Mel, we forgot to say that we're going to say CFS. We're going to use this abbreviation for child-friendly space, so you'll hear that a lot. So the session that we're going to do here, they also build on children's development, benefiting from positive attachment to caregivers. And findings also show how much the social environment of children and families, as culture, social cohesion, material resources, and identity, how important these factors are.
So this online training is a crash course or a short introductory course, and it's going to teach you about setting up and running a child-friendly space. It's for people who want to begin and need to learn about the basics or the essential. Of course, there is a lot more to learn and to do in child-friendly spaces. So what we're going to do in this training to make it more interactive is we're going to work with different case studies or different scenarios. We're going to set some of these up for you, which you can use, or you're also most welcome to make your own scenarios which fit your own context so you can apply the learning there. The training is going to be recorded as 3 separate sessions. And at times we're going to ask you to pause the video and do some activities on your own.
So what about if you're on your own, working alone, or as a group? Can you do both?
Yeah, you can do both. So if you're working alone, then we do encourage you to try and get a buddy if you can, because it's really nice to be able to bounce ideas that you have with someone else and to discuss it. And if you're in a group, this is also an ideal training for the group setting. So you could work around a big table or in a big group and talk about the activities within the group. If you're very large, you could break into smaller groups and come back together.
Smart. And we're going to have 3 different sessions, and session 1 is going to cover the introduction that we're doing right now, the expectations, and we're going to work on the ground rules. We're going to work on the need for creating protective environments for children, the role of play in child development, children's well-being, assess the need for a CFS, and also the needs of children. And then we're going to discuss the selection of the site and what you're going to put into the child-friendly space in terms of materials. When we end the session, we have some proposals for you, suggestions for what you can do to prepare for the next session.
So in session 2, then we're going to dive much more deeply into child safeguarding, particularly looking at who's responsible for child safeguarding. We're also going to go into the promotion of inclusion in a child-friendly space and talk about the factors that promote resilience in children. Very importantly, we're going to talk about how to involve caregivers and community members to help strengthen the child protection capacities. Then we're going to do some really interesting activities from the child-friendly activity catalogue, which are about the opening and closing themes for a child-friendly space. Then we'll end session 2 and give you some suggestions on how you can prepare yourself well for session 3.
And in session 3, we are going to go into using local games and activities, how we can support children in distress, plan themed session on psychosocial topics, and also plan based on the future needs of children that you will see in your specific context. Do a bit on psychoeducation and talk about how we actively involve the children who in the daily running of the space. And also to do something on the monitoring that you will have to do on a daily basis. And now we will ask you to do the first exercise. So take a pause for a few minutes, note down your expectations of this training. Go to the workbook and note down the answers to the questions. What do you expect to get out of the sessions? And do your expectations match the planned content? Welcome back from the work that you just did in your workbook. The reason we asked about your expectations is that you need to keep the expectations of children and their caregivers in mind all the time in the safe space so that you can continuously adapt the activities. And if I turn to you, how did the plan correspond to your expectation of this training? And since we don't know you, it's been difficult to assess your needs for it. Well, usually when we're in a training or in a CFS, we can adapt as we go along. And in this pre-recorded format, we couldn't do that. Therefore, we asked the mental health and psychosocial support focal persons in the national societies before we started to develop it, what they thought we should include in these introductory sessions.
So Ia, I was wondering if I could ask you about when you were a child, what was one of your favourite games, something you found really fun and enjoyable?
Actually, I grew up where we had an enclosed yard, and all the children from small to 18 years old, they would socialize there in the afternoons and evenings. And there was one game that we particularly enjoyed. It was a run, skip. What is it called when you're tagging somebody? A kick the can kind of game, yeah. And everybody would play it, and it would go on and on and on for hours, and we never wanted it to stop.
Wow, I can see how much fun that game was because you're smiling so much and your eyes were sparkling. So that's obviously something you still remember and
Absolutely.
have enjoyable memories from.
Yeah.
So now what we're going to do is we're going to ask you to think about what your favourite game was that you played as a child and that you enjoyed very much. So if you're working on your own, we ask you just to note it down in the workbook and think about especially what made that game so enjoyable. And if you're in a group, this is a good time to introduce yourself to each other if you haven't met each other yet or don't know everybody's name in the room. And also you can do a round of everyone who's in the group to talk about where you can present what your favourite game was and why you enjoyed it so much.
Let's move on and discuss how we can do the ground rules. And one thing that we want to do is to ensure that the ground rules, they are all about making the child-friendly space safe. Next, we want to make it inclusive. And also, we want to make it fun. So since there's no training since there's no children in this training, you can work on creating ground rules in a way that you could use with the children. And when creating the rules, we ask you to formulate the ground rules in the positive. So I'm going to ask Mel, what's an example of a positive ground rule?
Well, one rule that I've often heard people set in child-friendly spaces and when working with children is don't shout or no loud voices. And when the rule is phrased in this way, which is in the negative, what we're doing is we're actually reinforcing the thing that we don't want to happen, which is shouting. So if we want to have don't shout framed in the positive, then we might make this rule please be quiet. Therefore, you're mentioning the desired behaviour or the desired action that you want and reinforcing it so that the children are remembering that rule, please be quiet.
So there are other ways you can phrase it. Instead of saying don't do that, you can say treat the toys kindly. You can say, instead of saying don't be late, you can say please be on time. So remember that when you're formulating the ground rules.
So now we want you to pause the video and turn to the exercise in your workbook about formulating ground rules. And what we would like you to do is, if you're doing this training on your own, then note down ground rules that would fit into a child-friendly space, into your context, and remember to frame them in the positive. And if you're doing this training in a group, then we would like you to discuss and agree on the ground rules that you are going to use for this training, again framing them in the positive. So, welcome back. So hopefully you had a good turn at trying to make those ground rules in the positive. It can be a bit difficult if you haven't done it before, but over time it starts to become much more natural to frame rules in the positive. We're going to give you a couple of examples. Probably you already have many of these examples down yourself, but here are some examples framed in the positive for ground rules. We could say, we listen to each other. One voice at a time. Be kind. Boys and girls are equal. Questions are welcome. It's okay to challenge. And photos need consent.
In the activity catalogue, you will find on page 34, 1.2, what we expect from each other. You will find more on how to create the ground rules. We'd like also to mention that in some cultures, disciplinary measures are often used after breaking a rule. It can be at home or it can be in a class. Instead of such an action or a punishment, you can agree on a restorative action that a child could do. It could be helping a peer with a task or studies, or it could be something else that needs to be done for the group as a whole. And studies show that this has a positive effect on children's well-being.
So now we're going to move on to talking about why we would have a child-friendly space in humanitarian settings. And in this section, what we're going to talk about is, very importantly, the role of play in children's development. We're also going to talk about the needs of children in humanitarian settings and why children come to child-friendly spaces or come to a CFS. So child-friendly spaces are established in humanitarian settings because children affected by primary or secondary crisis or traumatic events may have difficulty being able to recognise their own emotions. They might also have difficulty reading the emotions of others, of regulating themselves, and even they can present with stress symptoms such as sleeping difficulties or a regression or backwards movement in their development. Also, children sometimes can have difficulty with impulse regulation. Children growing up in normal circumstances intuitively learn about the world through play. The body is the foundation for understanding and exploring the world, to meet challenges and to negotiate with others, such as when we're playing. A child-friendly space doesn't replace or compete with school-based education. Rather, the child-friendly space and the schedule should take the schooling into consideration. So in a child-friendly space, there'll be different types of activities, and these activities can be both structured or free play or unstructured. So let's look at the role of play in children's development and what children can learn from playing. At the beginning of this training, I asked Ia what one of her favourite play activities or one of her most enjoyable play activities was when she was a child. And Ia, you told us about that game Kick the Can or Tag that you played. I can see you really smiling because you enjoyed it so much. And what did you learn from being engaged in this play activity when you were a child?
So when I'm thinking about it, there was so much we learned. So we learned to take turns, we learned to play with children of all ages. The older children, they took care of us, and we took care because I was in the middle of the smaller ones. We learned to have an overview of what was going to happen. Sometimes we took the lead, and sometimes we were led. And I think that we learned to go by rules, and we also learned to speak up, because you needed to do a loud voice to be heard. So that was one thing, how to be heard in a group of other children who were also trying to speak up. So there were actually many things that we learned.
So there were a lot of learnings in Ia's play activity that she described, and these are kind of life skills that Ia has no doubt been applying throughout her life. So children can learn and do learn so much during play, and this is why play is such an important part of children's development.
And one thing I forgot to mention is that we also learned to come to the rescue of a friend, and then we enjoy being physically active because it was a very active game.
Yeah, so just so many learnings from this simple activity, play or kick the can. And children do learn so much throughout play. It's not just a game, it is where children learn life skills and it progresses their development. What we're going to ask you to do now is to do an activity. So after I say the instructions, please pause the video. And if you're doing this training on your own, what we would like you to do is to take some time to think about what was an enjoyable activity that you did as a child, and what did you learn through that playing? What skills or competencies did you learn or develop? And write it down in the workbook. And if you're doing this training as a group, take a few minutes, 1 or 2 minutes, to think about your favourite activity and what you learned, which skills and competencies you acquired, and then either note it down on your workbook or, even better, discuss it with the group.
Welcome back. So I hope that you made a lot of notes on what you learned from playing as a child. And through play, children learn motor skills, body awareness, and they learn to socialize, think, and reason. And in short, you could say that play teaches children to show initiative, to plan and follow a plan through, to apply abstract concept to real life, to reason in a logical and analytical manner by acting, to communicate and negotiate with peers, and to take satisfaction from achievements. So play provides a context for children to try new social skills and challenging new tasks, and also to solve complex problems. And they also express their ideas, thoughts and feelings when they're engaging in symbolic play. That could be, for instance, with a game of Lego, where you have the bricks, and if you want to create a farm, I could create a farm with Mel, and we could have some cows or some grass. We could have that here. And then we're learning about how to do a farm. We're planning, and we are learning about real life situations. Children can also learn how to control emotions, interacting with others, resolve conflicts, and gain, thus, sense of competence. And also they become imaginative. So one thing we do know is that children who are skilled at play have more power, influence, and capacity to create meaningful lives. It helps them to cope with new experiences because a playful attitude can enable the mind to explore and remain open to newer possibilities. And this is something that we need to keep in mind because we're doing the CFS in a humanitarian setting.
Now we're going to move on to talking about well-being and what we need to consider the different areas of children's lives when we're setting up a child-friendly space. So Ia here has taken a piece of paper, and in a moment I'm going to ask you to take out a pen and paper and make a copy of this picture, which is a very simple flower with 7 petals on it. And this flower is often referred to as the well-being flower. And if we think about what a child needs at any age, there are 7 key areas, each represented by 1 petal here on the flower. We're just going to go through each petal and talk about a little bit about what each area refers to. So first of all, we have the social area. So this is talking about the well-being that children can feel from being able to feel a sense of belonging and to be with and play with others and make social connections. The next area of the well-being flower is called spiritual. And this refers to the connection that people can feel with their God or with their religious beliefs or with their own belief in life beliefs that they might have, which might not be religious. And having a good sense of spiritual well-being can also promote really positive well-being within children. The next petal of the well-being flower is called cultural. And as we know, culture changes and adapts over time. But one thing that's really important about culture is it provides us with a sense of stability. It provides us with predictability. We know what's going to happen when we know about the cultural norms of our that are relevant to us. And the next area that we have on the petal is called mental, or some people call this cognitive. So that refers to our mind and keeping our mind stimulated and engaged, be that through learning new things. And as Ia had talked about earlier, we learn so much through play. So it's a very important area to think about the mental stimulation of children in a child-friendly space. The next petal is called emotional. So emotional refers to our feelings, and it is such an important part of a child-friendly space to be doing work around emotional well-being, because as we talked about, children might have difficulty regulating their emotions, and this is something that we can work on within a child-friendly space. Next, we come to the petal called biological, and this has to do with our health and well-being. So when children have experienced distress or have been through severe disruptions, then we can see changes in the biological well-being of children. And that's why it's so important to promote things like healthy eating and sleep and other things related to good health. And the final petal we come to on the well-being flower is called material. And this refers to having our basic needs met in terms of material goods. So that could be the ability to buy food, the ability to be able to afford to be in some kind of shelter. So now we would like you to pause the video and make your own drawing of a well-being flower. So that's a simple flower with 7 petals, and each petal has the names on it as described in the video. And if you're on your own, we would like you to note down the ways that a CFS and the activities within it can support the well-being of children on each of these 7 different areas. And if you're doing this training in a group, then you might like to distribute the petals between yourselves so that each has a different petal. And then you can note down the ways, again, that a child-friendly space and the activity within it can support each area of well-being. So take at least 5 minutes to fill out this flower, potentially more, and then spend time to share with the group the different ways that a child-friendly space can promote well-being in each of these 7 areas.
So welcome back. We hope you filled out the well-being flower and had some great ideas. Now, the most overlooked aspects of the well-being flower are usually the mental and the spiritual. And the mental covers learning, being mentally stimulated to learn, to analyze, to think independently, to develop a critical approach, to be able to see different sides of a matter, and knowing how to find trusted information. In many humanitarian settings, children are not able to continue their education. And this is when a child-friendly space can keep them learning to learn, so it's easier for them to catch up later on. And that's a very important aspect of the child-friendly space. And ways you can do that is to have a quiet corner where children can sit and read. So you can have somebody read aloud to them. You can discuss the stories that you're reading. You can create stories. You can write stories. You can create cartoons. All these are ways to stimulate the mental petal of the well-being flower. Do you have other ideas, Mel?
I think there's so many ways to stimulate, like doing puzzles, allowing children to have free play as well as structured play can stimulate the mental area.
Right. And also the spiritual practice. You have something to say on the spiritual aspect of the flower.
Yeah, so in addition to the mental being often overlooked, also the spiritual area is often overlooked in child-friendly spaces. So the spiritual area, or practicing spiritual or religious or other life beliefs, we know it can promote positive well-being because it can create a sense of meaning and purpose in life, and also connection with the divine. So the spiritual can be supported in a child-friendly space in so many different ways. For example, through the simple act of promoting acceptance and tolerance of different spiritual outlooks. Also providing a quiet space for prayers or contemplation are other ways that we can help to promote the spiritual aspect of the well-being flower and of children. So when the well-being flower is collected together and all of the petals are each thought about within the child-friendly space, each petal is no longer isolated from itself, but it is a whole for the children. And psychosocial activities in emergencies can help children to make meaning of events in their lives. It gives them skills for coping, skills for handling crisis, and they also learn skills to manage their emotions. They learn skills to build relationships, and they learn skills on how best to respond to the different events that are going on around them. So in a child-friendly space, children experiment and they pay attention and they're actively engaged in problem solving. And when they're engaged in this creative process and they're learning, the neurobiological effects are going on in their brains and they're developing a desire to learn. They're keeping that desire alive even though schools might be closed or other options for learning might not be available to them due to the humanitarian situation. And then children are not learning because someone's telling them to learn, but because they're developing this burning desire to learn. And that's why it's so important that we make that child-friendly space safe, inclusive and fun, so children build that desire to learn. So the Wellbeing Flower not only includes these 7 areas, but it also includes relationships and family and community networks, our social values and our spiritual and cultural practices. And all of these things within the Wellbeing Flower contribute to protection of children.
And around that Wellbeing Flower, you actually make a circle. Because all this happens within a framework of protection, development, and active participation. So psychosocial support involves strengthening the systems that provide protection to children. This means that you improve the capacity of the adults, including parents, teachers, local leaders, faith leaders, government representatives, everybody who's a duty bearer and has to respond actually or have to respond adequately to children's needs and their rights to protection from abuse, neglect and harm. And also we'd like you to be aware that there is a certain set of minimum standards for child protection and humanitarian action. The abbreviation is CPMS, and they're a key resource for managers and staff implementing a child-friendly space. We will come back on to child safeguarding in the next session, but you can also consult the minimum standards.
So now we're going to move on to assessment, both assessing the needs for a child-friendly space and assessing the needs of the children and the caregivers. And in your workbooks under number 5 assessments, you'll see that we have already prepared some cases for you. So take some time to read through these cases and see if they're relevant for you and select one that you would like to work with. Or even better, we encourage you to create a case of your own to use within this training that fits your specific context and needs. When you turn to your workbook, you'll see that there's a template for creating your own case. And within the template, what we would like you to do is briefly describe the recent events and the current situation in the area. Note where the CFS is located and any main information or features about its facilities. Also note if there are any safety risks to the CFS and to the community, and indicate how many children and from which age this CFS could accommodate. It's also good to know what hours it will be open. Sometimes the CFS is just open for a few hours and sometimes much longer. Also note down any key information that's relevant to your CFS. You can use the cases that are already in the workbook as a model. As you see, we've kept the cases quite short because that will make it easier to work with them within the video. One thing that's really important to think about when we are setting up a CFS is to think about the ratio of staff to volunteers. And we actually want to tell you about the recommendations that are set forth about how many facilitators there should be to the number of children. So the recommendations are for 2 adult facilitators if there are 20 children aged 5 to 9. If the children are older, aged 10 to 12, then there can be 25 to 2 facilitators. And again, in that older age bracket of 13 to 18, then it can be up to 30 children for 2 facilitators. So this is something that's very important to think about when you're going to staff your child-friendly space. And if you want to know more, which you do want to know more, about planning and running a child-friendly space and how to do an assessment of needs, then the basics can be found on assessment in the operational guide on page 18.
And let's think about what kind of information we'd need. So first of all, Mel, what you need to know if you want to set up if you want to find out if the child-friendly space is needed, what you need to do?
Well, the first thing you need to do is find out if there's access to schooling already, if there's already access to protection supports, and if mental health and psychosocial supports are already available. If these three things are already available, then there's much less likelihood that you would need a child-friendly space. If we find these things are not available due to the humanitarian crisis or due to the situation that's occurred, then the need for a child-friendly space is likely high due to the centrality of play and having a safe and inclusive space for children.
And anything special to think about if it's, for example, still doing COVID-19?
Yeah, there's a lot of things to think about if there's things like COVID-19 or if there's an epidemic outbreak, and you need to think about sanitation. You might need to change the ratio of adults to children. You need to think about the size of the space and what would be safe and appropriate given any medical or other situations that are going on in the context.
So we've been talking about community leaders, and how would you consult with them, and what would you consult with them on?
Well, it's really important to get buy-in from the community about having a child-friendly space within their community. And sometimes we might need to explain to people the importance of play and the importance of having a child-friendly space to the community. The community can give us lots of ideas on how to run a child-friendly space well, what activities to have inside it, where the best site location might be. So not only can we promote child-friendly space when working with the community, we can also get buy-in. Caregivers and community members are usually and most helpfully when they're part of the child-friendly space, maybe as a facilitator or as someone that we can consult on different aspects of child-friendly space.
And how do we ensure that we include the vulnerable groups in the child-friendly space?
Well, the first thing to do if we want to include vulnerable groups is to think about what types of vulnerabilities generally exist in the population that we're working with. We know, for example, that around on average 15% of any population will present with disabilities, either invisible or visible. So we should always be thinking about disability inclusion. Also with child-friendly spaces, they're operating within a humanitarian context, and they might be people on the move, people in different cultures, so we need to think about the language to ensure people are included as well.
And do you think that the needs for boys and girls would always be the same, or would they always be different? How do you include that? And if you have children of different genders, other genders than boys and girls?
Well, one way that we can find out a lot about this is again by talking to the community about the different roles that boys and girls have within the community, the different activities they might engage in and different types of play, and how they're seen within the community, if it's okay to mix various genders, if it would be better to set up our child-friendly space in a way that segregates the genders and various aspects like this. So we do always need to think about gender in a child-friendly space.
So I'm thinking, what about if you're allocated by the authorities, set up your child-friendly space here? How do you, and you think it's not safe for girls and boys and children of other genders, what do you do then?
Well, the first thing you can do is speak to the community and try and get them to help you advocate with the authorities to find somewhere safe, because again we go back to those three principles of safety, inclusion and fun. This child-friendly space needs to be safe. Often or sometimes we cannot select the site ourselves, so we have to work with what we've given and think about other elements for how we could make the safe more safe. For example, changing the timing of when the activity is on to ensure that parents could accompany or that it's not late at night.
Good point, thank you. And now we'd like you to pause the video and go back to the case that you were just working on. And if you're on your own, take 10 minutes to answer 6 questions that I will give you in a minute. And if you're a group, you'd need around 15 to 20 minutes, because then you would have more ideas to discuss the 6 questions that's coming up now. So why would the children come to the CFS in your case? How are they affected? What are their immediate needs? What are the needs of their caregivers? How would you conduct the assessment? And who would you talk to in order to assess the needs? Thinking back to the Wellbeing Flower can help guide your discussions or your thoughts. So please pause the video and go to your workbooks. So welcome back. My colleague, who's now become an official colleague from the Red Crescent, is planning to interview me. I'm a grandmother and I'm going to be interviewed for an assessment. But first of all, she will do a demonstration of how to obtain informed consent. Because whenever we do assessment interviews, we must always ask for consent. And the consent follows the following, and you can find it in your workbook. The name and the organization of the assessor or the team, a description of the work of the organization, purpose of the assessment, information for participants in the assessment about anonymity and the voluntary nature of participation, and there should be times for questions from informants. Finally, written or verbal permission or refusal to be interviewed. And one thing you do also want to include is that the informant can stop the interview at any time. So we're going to conduct a demonstration. We want you to follow it in the workbook. Does my colleague do everything that she's supposed to do, or does she miss out on a few things? So here we go.
Hello. Hi there. I work for the IFRC and I've been working in this area for a while. So
Okay.
what I'm doing now is I'm talking to people who live in the area, and what we want to do is establish a safe space for children.
Okay, safe space for children, sounds good. Yeah.
So what we'd like to know is what kind of problems you face.
Right.
And we so then once we know that, we can decide how to offer the best type of support. We can't promise to give you support in exchange for this interview, though. I just want you to know that. We're only here to ask questions and learn a lot from your experiences. I'm sure you have a lot of experiences we'd like to learn from. So if you choose to be interviewed, we're going to keep your information private, anonymous. We're not going to share it with anybody. I won't be writing your name on this form, so the information is all anonymous. Do you have any questions at all?
You mentioned child-friendly space. What's that? Did you mention that?
Yeah, that's a space where children can feel really safe.
Sounds good.
Yeah,
Okay,
and
good.
it's
Yeah,
a very
I'm happy.
friendly and welcoming space for children.
Okay, good.
Mm-hmm. So would you like to be interviewed?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. So pause the video. If you're doing this session on your own, what would you do differently if you're doing an assessment interview? Next, practice asking for informed consent as if you're sitting with somebody. And if you're doing this session in a group, discuss what was missing and what you would do differently. Next, practice asking for informed consent in pairs. Discuss what went well when you're doing that and if anything could be improved. Welcome back. Now you probably noticed that the interviewer did not give a name. She did not say that they were working with children and families, that they wanted to know about problems faced by children, or say that it was voluntary to take part in the interview. So let's move on. We will look at the case of establishing a child-friendly space in an urban setting in a shelter. If you have been using and working with another case, please pause the video and read this case now in your workbook. We're now going to conduct an assessment interview, and I am no longer the granny. Now I am a child, and I am being interviewed using the questions that you can also find in the workbook so that you can follow it as the interview unfolds.
Okay, so I've already obtained informed consent from my child, whose name is Sarah, that I'm interviewing. And we've already had a small chat and kind of set the tone. So I'm just going to launch straight into the questions now so you can see how that rolls. Okay, so Sarah, I just wanted to ask you, what kind of things do boys and girls like to do during the day now?
After we've had breakfast, then we go to, there's a corner where we can sit and read, me and the other girls. Usually the boys go out and they play football. They're more or less out all of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the evening we queue for the food, and then we sit with our mummies on our beds, and the boys sit with their fathers or their mummies also on their beds. That's a bit boring.
Mm-hmm. So that's what a normal day looks
Yeah.
like for boys and girls.
Yeah.
And what about before the crisis, Sarah? What did a normal day look like then? What did boys and girls do?
Oh, that was great. After breakfast we would go to school, and after school we would have activities. I was in the sport, I was doing sports, and my brothers were also doing sports, and a lot of children were doing that. And then very often there would be somebody playing in the fields in the early evening before we went to dinner, and then we had to do homework.
Mm-hmm. So quite a lot of things are different now from how they used to be. Yeah. And I wanted to ask you, Sarah, are there any places here where boys and girls feel safe and good?
I think the boys feel really safe outside because they like to be outside playing, and we go outside, but we sit on the bench just along the house. Nobody has told us or shown us how far we can go.
Mm-hmm.
So we feel safe, mostly safe when we're close to where we can see where our mothers are most of the time.
So that's somewhere where girls feel safe and good on the bench, and boys feel safe and good when they're outside. And what about places where boys and girls might not feel safe or might not feel good? Do you know anywhere like that?
Mostly I think it's in the bathroom because they're very big and it's pretty scary. Also, some of the toilets don't have lock on the door, so when we come at night, I don't like it. So I think boys don't like it either. But sometimes some boys tease us, and we don't like that either. They took my teddy the other day. I didn't like that.
Okay.
Got it back.
Oh, that's good that you got it back. Does your teddy have a name?
It's called Duck.
Ducky. So some of the places where you don't feel good, boys and girls in the bathrooms, and also if there's big boys teasing the girls. Is there anywhere else where any children might not feel safe or not feel good?
No, I think that all children here, we're very lucky that we've all got some family members with us, so that's a good thing. We feel safe with them.
And I wanted to ask a few more questions. Is that okay? Yeah. If children have a problem, is there someone that they can talk to about those problems?
There's actually a very nice lady from the Red Cross. She comes and she walks around and she does soap bubbles with us. She comes once or every second day maybe, and we can talk to her. She actually sits with us and talks and reads a book on children being heroes. That's very nice. And some of the children can talk to their mummies, of course, but I know that some don't feel they can. They have heard that.
Okay. And what do you think children can do to feel better or to feel good? What is the things that children could do?
I think that we want more spaces where we can play and come together, where we know that there will be somebody to help us if there's a fight. When the big boys are being very noisy, they can calm them down. So, and we want more toys because I only got my duck with me, so we need more toys.
So children can play to feel better. Children can ask for more things that they need. Okay, that's a few things that children can do. And what kind of things do children need to learn or need to change so they can feel better or good? What do you think?
So actually, my mom sometimes tells me that I should tell the boys off when they are misbehaving. So maybe somebody can teach us about being good friends and stop teasing others, bullying.
So that's an idea that your mum had. And what about you? Do you have any ideas of your own as well? Or
No,
that
I
other
think
children?
it sounds good. I don't want to be bullied anymore, or don't want them to take my teddy.
Don't want them to take
No.
Ducky, of
No.
course not.
No.
It's a very cute teddy. So there we have 7 interview questions that I've done with this child here, Sarah. And you might kind of notice the way that I ask the questions, the tone of voice, potentially we wouldn't be sitting here on stools, we'd be finding a nice, quiet, private space to do that. But that gives you an idea of how to run through some assessment questions with a child and to make them child focused. So to make sure you're really drawing out the things that are important to children. And you might notice that I asked a lot of questions for her ideas on how she could, or how children could feel better, because children have very excellent ideas which should be central to the way that the activities are set up in the child-friendly space.
So now we're going over how to select the site for the child-friendly space. And I'm going to interview my colleague here on what you need to find out. So there's a few questions that you can also find guidance in page 19 and onwards in the operational guidance. So Mel, what can you tell me about the space itself?
We've already talked about a few aspects, such as the ratio of caregivers to children, but also the space needs to be safe, fun and inclusive. So it needs to be big enough, it needs to be accessible to people with different needs and different abilities. It needs to have spaces where children can have privacy as well. So there's a lot of things inside the space that we need to think about. These are just a few that I'm mentioning. But also in terms of the location of the space, it needs to be somewhere that is a safe area already. So we don't want children passing through a dangerous route to get to our child-friendly space. That would be increasing protection risks and would not be serving the purpose of making a safe space for children. So we need to think about the external environment and the routes that children might take to reach the space as well.
Great. So you have covered some of the child safeguarding risks that we would usually think about. Are there any other risks that could be potential risk to children coming to a child-friendly space?
There's quite a lot of risk for children coming to a child-friendly space. So, for example, we wouldn't put it in a flood zone or something like this. We really need to have good consideration of the location. Also, our space could become not inclusive if we are not thinking in advance about how to promote inclusion. And if we haven't brought the community in, there might be a lot of opposition to the child-friendly space existing.
So how do you go about that if you have opposition from the community? What do you do?
Well, in the ideal world, which is not always how it is in the humanitarian context, you would have a conversation with the community, a number of conversations with the community first to find out about their ideas and willingness to have the space within their community. Also having an open forum where you can discuss with the community about how this space should be, what we want the purpose to serve can be helpful. And also, one of the really critical things of a child-friendly space is having a suggestion or a complaints box, which is open to both adults and children and community leaders or community members. That way people can express their opinions and views on the child-friendly space, and they can do this in an anonymous way also, which is very helpful for people to feel more open to talk about any problems that they might have with the child-friendly space or that might be going on.
And what about collaboration? Because sometimes there could be the location or the place of the child-friendly space could be quite big, so there could be other organizations. Do you set up necessarily collaboration with the others?
Yeah, it depends what the services are. Sometimes as the Red Cross, Red Crescent, we're looking for neutrality, so we might not set up, for example, against the same location as another organisation that has a strong political affiliation or a strong negative standing in the community. But normally we are looking for cooperation. Often there can be a number of child-friendly spaces run across a large humanitarian crisis or a large area. And working in collaboration with those spaces is really important. We can all learn from each other's mistakes and from each other's positive aspects, and having that collaboration can really strengthen our child-friendly space as well.
Great. Anything else we should think about when setting up the space and finding it?
I think we're going to talk about this more in later sessions, but we really need to think about disability inclusion and ways that we can promote that from the very outset before we've made any plans at all for the child-friendly space. And gender, of course, we need to be thinking about how to accommodate gender within our space. And protection, of course, always. We have to look at those child safeguarding issues and issues around protection.
Right. Okay, sounds good. So look at this, we're gonna move on. And when it comes to equipping the space, we'd like you to go to the operational guidance and look at what you need when you need to equip the space. We're ending the session. If you're working on your own, please note down the immediate 3 takeaways in your workbook. If you're working in a group, conduct a round of the main takeaway that each of you have. We'd also like you to prepare for session 2. And we'd like you to first of all have a look at the Child-Friendly Space activity cards to get familiar with these. Try out the instructions with others before you do session 2. Also, we'd like you to read the IFRC policy on child safeguarding, and you should read it before the next session, and there are a few questions that you can answer in your notebook. First of all, have you been trained in the IFRC child safeguarding policy in your national society? Second question, do you know how to report should there be any concerns about a child in a child-friendly space? And thirdly, make a mental note of the main points in the policy. So thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you, Mel. We're going to see you next time.
I'll just launch straight into the questions.
Yes.